Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I am Sanjana. I work as an associate of Belong Research Collective, and I welcome you all to the 6th day of the inaugural edition of the xSDG UnConference, which is an initiative of Belong. A little bit about Belong for more context. Belong is a social innovation platform that seeks to offer discrimination-free services to people who are otherwise marginalized on the basis of their identities. Now, it could be on the basis of caste, gender, ethnicity, disability, and so on and so forth. We run programs for 3 major verticals, and these are called the Research Collective, which is what the UnConference is a part of, the Mental Health Collective, and the Literature Collective. The UnConference is a part of one of our major initiatives that Belong, called the xSDG platform, which is a global platform to promote truly intersectional and inclusive development. At xSDG, we've been curating resources in terms of research papers, reports, data sets that are focused especially on development, but through the lens of intersectional identities. Now on to the UnConference. The UnConference is in collaboration with organizations such as Dalberg, JPAL South Asia, and Breakthrough India. It started on the 18th and will go run up till the 31st of August. We have about 15 to 20 panels that talk about understanding how SDG programming and funding can better address the needs of people who are marginalized on the basis of their identity. The UnConference has been featuring and will continue to feature interactive sessions with leading thinkers, doers, funders, and development experts who are working on these themes of SDGs through the lens of intersectionality. Now, before I hand it over to Neerath, I just want to take a moment to introduce Neerath, who's the moderator of the session. Neerath is the founder of Belong, and he's also a partner at Dalberg Advisors. He leads the firm's Delhi office and also heads up water and sanitation practice of Dalberg's Advisors. Thanks once again, and over to you, Neerath.
Thanks, Anjana. I'm really excited to kickstart this session on making global WASH programming more inclusive, and really excited to have 3 friends as fellow panelists, Nalini, Madhavan, and Manoj. I'll introduce them formally in just a minute, but I do want to begin by offering a little bit about why this topic is something that I feel is personally really important and why it deserves more attention. So all of us who work in WASH, different parts of WASH, water and sanitation, we know that even now, even with the best of efforts, both in India and globally, there's still billions of people who don't actually have access to safe drinking water, access to toilets, and waste management services, hygiene services. But the problem that gets exacerbated for many hundreds of millions of people, if not more, is not spoken enough about. So there are millions of people in the world who have certain, one could call them identity markers. So disabilities, things like their caste, their gender, belonging to certain indigenous sort of populations, which are very far away from so-called developed areas. Hundreds of millions of people who have these kinds of characteristics sort of face a double whammy when it comes to water sanitation and hygiene. And the numbers are very, very large. So according to data by IRC or UNICEF, between 750 million to 1 billion people actually have some form of disability, and a large fraction of them are concentrated in the developing countries. And many of them actually face very large challenges in accessing things like wash services. Similarly, there are tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people who in South Asia who carry caste identities that lead to profound challenges in claiming access to wash services, also working in the wash value chains. Similarly, millions of people in areas defined by sort of or indigenous populations who don't get access to services, who are back of the queue. So the problem is really large, but it does not get enough attention. And I thought it would be really important for us to actually have people who've been working on this topic. So Madhavan, Nalini, and Manoj, through their organizations and through the histories, have focused on different parts of this problem and have in their own way tried to make WASH more inclusive for certain kinds of populations. So the goal of this panel really is to first help us understand the way in which WASH ends up becoming, global WASH programming ends up becoming not inclusive, understand the reasons for that, and then look at some ways in which it can become inclusive, look at some sort of shining examples, some case studies, and I'd love to actually hear from all 3 of them about the work they've done, things they've noticed, and also finally end with some almost principles that we need to adhere to for this to be scaled in meaningful ways. So that's basically the session. Really excited to actually have a lot of people dial in now, and also people who actually see this when this gets packaged and delivered across different platforms. So without too much delay, let me begin by introducing our panelists. I'll begin with Nalini. Nalini Shekhar is the co-founder of Hasrudala, a newly formed waste pickers organization in Bangalore that has reached out to about 7,000 waste pickers in the city. She's also founded Kagad Kashtkari Panchayat, which is KKPKP, Union of Waste Pickers in Pune in 1997. She's really passionate about working with the unorganized sector of labor, who constitute about 90% of the Indian labor market, and she's worked extensively on the issue of violence against women, both in India and the US. Her main focus now is on the inclusion of waste pickers in the solid waste management process of urban local bodies. In Bangalore, Hasrudala has been working on integrating waste pickers in providing waste management services to bulk generators and also managing dry waste collection centers. Welcome, Nalini, and thanks for taking time for this. Next, I'll introduce Madhavan. So VK Madhavan is the Chief Executive at WaterAid India and looks at all of WaterAid's activities in India. Previously, Madhavan was the Managing Director of Skills Education Private Limited. He's also a TED Global Fellow and a TED Senior Fellow. He's also worked with ActionAid and the Hunger Project, and also has spent 8 years working in Uttarakhand with the Central Himalayan Rural Action Group, Chirag. Thanks, Madhavan, for taking time. Really good to have you here. Finally, but definitely not the least, Manoj Bulati, who's the Managing Director of Water.org in India. Manoj, in this role, champions Water.org's strategy, vision, and WASH program expansion in India. He's also responsible for strategic partnerships and that increase access to financing for WASH. He's had more than 25 years of experience in IT, supply chain management and development, both in India and the US. Previously, he was Senior Director for Southeast Asia and Country Director for SiteLife, and was instrumental in scaling operations for over 17 iBanks in the region. Manoj also serves on the steering committee for the India Sanitation Coalition, as is Madhavan actually. And Manoj is also the chair of IC Credit Financing Working Group. Welcome, Manoj, and thanks again for taking time. Okay, so with that, let me jump right into the questions. So first, an easy one to sort of just set context for the people who are listening in and also seeing this. We'll begin with Nalini and then go to Madhavan and Manoj. Please describe the work that your organization does in WASH beyond what I might have introduced, and also if there's something about intersectionality that you want to describe, that would be really, really exciting for everyone to hear. So Nalini, over to you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. And Hasrudala is an organization, impact organization that works with waste pickers. So here today, I'm talking about waste pickers as consumers of WASH. I'm talking about waste pickers as providers of services. So these, I'm sure all three speakers would also be talking about in both these roles that our constituency work. So we work with waste pickers across Karnataka and a few places in Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh. And we work with 30,000 waste pickers across. About 7,500 people in Bangalore have received ID card, but we work with almost 30,000. So when you talk about this particular community, it's a very large community, silently working, and the recognition for them with the local municipality is not there, but they are filling the gaps that municipality is leaving. So in 2011, we did a study to show 1,050 tons of waste is managed by waste pickers in the city. That saves the city about 84 crores per annum. So after that, we have really looked at different ways of integrating waste pickers into solid waste management services of the city. And that's how we started in Bangalore. Now we are in 24 cities. And that's my interest in being part of it. How do we do an inclusive, systematic inclusion and institutionalizing the inclusion of waste pickers in solid waste management.
Thanks, Nalini. Thanks for and really looking forward to some of your perspectives on that side of the sanitation value chain. Madhan, over to you.
Thanks, Neeraj. So we work in rural parts of the country, and we also work in some urban settlements. And essentially, we work across 4 thematic areas. The provision of safe, assured drinking water at a household level for families, to ensure that sanitation is safely managed, to focus on WASH in 3 different kinds of institutions: Anganwadis, schools, and healthcare facilities. And finally, work on hygiene, which is not just limited to hand hygiene, but also includes hygienic handling of food, of water, and menstrual hygiene management. Now, for us, it is very clear that exclusion is systemic, and therefore success for us is not just in merely ensuring that communities that we work with become WASH secure, but success is about ensuring that those who are the most vulnerable and marginalized actually gain access to these services. And so very often in areas where we work intensively, our work actually commences with a baseline, which is both primary data collection, also using participatory methods to identify who the most vulnerable in any habitation are likely to be. And success then at the end of a 5-year period would be on whether the most vulnerable actually gained access to those services at all or not. So for us, that's central to our success, that it's not enough to be able to say that a particular habitation has become WASH secure, but if the most vulnerable in that habitation have not actually gained access to the services, then we've failed as well. Part of our strategy also is, one, to demonstrate and then to provide technical support to government at various levels, whether it's the district, state, or national level, so that government can then scale up some of what we have demonstrated. So that in a nutshell is what we do.
Thanks, Manthan. And I really like the way you've described it, mapping most vulnerable and marginalized people within certain communities. And I'd love to double click on that when we speak. Manoj, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Neeraj. So Water.org's model is slightly different from the traditional, where our view on the theory of change that we put is that, first of all, the SDG 6, which requires $1.4 billion annually, there's going to be a financial gap. And that's going to be the primary reason, one of the key reasons why you will not be able to meet our SDG goals. Now, taking that further, if it means that if you can have alternative financing where as a financial product you can create it, then you can actually help bridge that the funding gap between what the government is providing and what can be the people needed. And it also provides them the funding at when they need it and beyond what the government is supporting them with. So it's both a supplementary and a complementary relationship. So we started to work as asset originators in 2005 in India. India was our primary place where we innovated with the idea. I used the analogy of saying we created the pipes of reaching the deep pockets, and that is through MFIs, through NBFCs, through connecting it with banks, connecting it with SRLMs, and being able to reach the people where they need it based on the financial inclusion model. Happy to say that now we've been able to, because the pipes have gone deep inroads into the rural, a lot of interest after it became priority sector, a lot of interest has built up with the banks, and a lot of now funds have started to flow into it. So currently, just to give a sense of how successful the model has been, India, the partners have done around 3.3 million loans and impacting around 15 million people, around 4,800, 4,900 crores of lending has successfully happened. So it's a very good way to have to build a solution for the long run, where there's a huge buy-in. When people take a loan, people also have a huge behavioral change in the process and less dependency on the institutional grant mechanisms. Back to you, Neeraj. Hopefully that's a quick introduction.
Yeah, no, thanks, Manoj. And really good. Actually hadn't realized that you've processed 3.3 million loans. So that's fantastic. That's quite some scale. So now, with that sort of as context for everyone who's listening in, let me actually invite you to the deep end, straight into the deep end. Tell me very honestly, from your vantage point, what are the different ways in which you think WASH programming, both in India and globally, is not inclusive? So for this one, maybe I'll invite Madhavan to go first, and then Manoj, and then Nalini.
Thanks, Neeraj. So I think the first thing that we need to recognize, and this holds true of India, and I would imagine it holds true pretty much anywhere in the world, that existing inequities in society will find reflection in access to any basic service. Yeah? So you can't look at inequities in isolation or basic service provision in isolation. And in some sense, the inequities then get perpetuated in access to all services. And so in the Indian context, the inequity can either be in the form of gender, in caste, class, ethnicity, religion, and then you have occupational groups. And in fact, you will then find an overlay of caste, gender, ethnicity, class on occupational groups as well. And then you're starting to see other groups, the differently abled, women-headed households. Increasingly now in a rural context, we're finding households with only the aged as also an extremely marginalized, vulnerable group. And I'll try and illustrate this with a few examples. So if you were to look at gender and access to, say, water, it's ironic that in 2021 or 2019 actually is when Jal Jeevan Mission was announced. The first time a national scheme to ensure piped water supply at a household level. I often wonder that if men had to go and fetch for water for their families instead of adolescent girls and women, would piped water supply at a household level have become the norm 20 years or 30 years earlier? Or is it simply because that we're a patriarchal society and that we don't recognize and value the labor and contribution of women who went and fetched water for us, that it took us till 2019 to even make water provision at a household level the priority? Take another example of menstrual hygiene management and take schools. Not just residential schools, but also day schools, high schools, senior secondary schools. And we've worked in some of these schools where we've done assessments of design, of the appropriateness and adequacy of toilets, for example, for girls. And you'd be shocked that very basic elements that would be essential to help adolescent girls manage during menstruation are non-existent. You won't find doors with a latch. You won't find hooks for them to hang their clothes while they're changing it. You won't find facilities for them to dispose of waste. And so something as essential as this doesn't even find its way into design. I remember having a conversation with someone responsible for ashram shalas, which are tribal schools, and we were talking about these essential elements. She was horrified that they hadn't even looked at latches and hooks in toilets for girls. Now, how expensive is this to provide for? So in some sense, we're completely blind to the fact that these needs exist. Yeah. We then also have spatial inequality, which then starts to mirror in some sense existing social inequalities. And that's why you will then start to find that there are particular hamlets or habitations that get left behind, which are the last to receive services. And when you very often start to look at which are these habitations that you get left behind, you will find that they could be for a particular caste, they could be a tribal group, or they could be a particular low-income family that happens to reside there. Or take another example of sanitation workers. Yeah. Now, the fact manual scavenging is banned by law in this country, yet it persists. And there's a systemic denial of the existence of manual scavenging, despite evidence to the contrary. Now, if there's also a close correlation between gender as well as caste and the persistence of manual scavenging. And one wonders whether those are reasons why actually we're not willing to make progress on this. And finally, look at something as simple as community or basic toilets. How many of our community and public toilets, for example, are inclusive? are accessible for people who are differently abled. If you look at large schemes which look at toilet provision, where designs ever looked at for differently abled people to use toilets, was there special allocations of resources to be able to fund those? Did we even look at design for elderly people to use toilet, or pregnant women, for example, to use them? So similarly, you don't look at community toilets or public toilets and say, are they women friendly? So I think we need to recognize that, in some sense, we are witnessing existing social inequities mirroring access, even in terms of basic services like wash.
Yeah, I think you've captured that really well, Martha, and I think you're absolutely right that the social inequities show up in different ways. The core remains the same; it just manifests in a slightly different way in WASH. Manoj, moving to you, given that you actually the discussion you and I had, Water.org obviously does a lot of financing work, but you also do a lot of innovation work focused on some of these things, right? On WASH and disability, etc. And you've also done some work in some sort of very remote locations. So we'll come to the actual work that has happened, but what is the way you and Water.org thinks about inequity and exclusion in WASH? I mean, what's your worldview? And how are you seeing it manifest in India and also the other locations you might work in Africa, etc.?
Sure. So, what comes for Water.org is the broader sense that this is a solvable problem. And the deeper, the more marginalized the pocket, and conversely, the more less mainstream that group is. The more it is marginalized, the more it is going to be delayed in the focus of the government. Water.org views this as the person who is whichever gender, if the person is marginalized, whatever be the criteria for marginalization, we need to be closer and working with them through alternative channels. So when we started, you've got to go deeper and deeper into the bottom of the economic pyramid, and you got to find. I always think about it, and I think for us, the idea of people with special needs, with disabilities, becomes very important because they kind of miss out in their journey, and they have got a lot of potential which is there. And I'm especially focusing on people with reduced mobility. So India has got, roughly 30 million people with disabilities. That's 3 crore people. Our numbers to us sometimes becomes like we don't even sink in the gravity of what we are saying. 3 crore people with disabilities, 20% of them with reduced mobility. If you are and with all respect to Nalini ji and to the better gender, if you're a woman living in a village and are a Dalit and have the disability and are above 35 years of age, what's the chance that you're going to get any kind of support and, a livelihood, a decent living for yourself? You kind of, by every virtue of it, you're just striking yourself one out, and you're just left very marginalized. And that's what we felt. So we started to work with these communities, and we started to see that what can be done to bring them back. It's also unfortunate these are the communities that actually get, around 40% of them never attend school just because they have disability, and it's a mobility disability. And so if we get inclusiveness set over there, we actually change a lot of their lives. So that's our thought process. Back to you.
Yeah, no, this is so important to actually, and we will explore this in quite some length, but thanks for sharing that, Manoj. Nali, moving to you. So both Madhavan and Manoj have described how inequities sort of show up on, let's say, the demand side, people who use wash services, but most of your work has focused on the supply side. So people who work in wash systems to offer these services, right? So how have you seen inequities because of somebody's identity, their gender, their caste, their ethnicity, etc., their disability? How does it manifest? What are the big problems that you see on the supply side of sanitation? You're on mute, Nalini.
I work in mostly urban areas, but we also work in rural, but in a very limited way. So when you look at urban areas, the waste pickers, the informal waste workers is really at the bottom rung of all the informal sector, other than, of course, manual scavenger. So what happens to us, one, I'll talk about as the consumers and consumers of these services, both at workplace as well as at home. So when you look at workplace, they're actually going on the street, picking up what you and me throw as waste, sort, grade, and make it into a tradable commodity. So they're doing fantastic work, but we don't see that. We see them as dirty. We see them as unclean, so they cannot access the public toilets. They are not allowed to drink water from the local hotels. Not allowed to, use the transportation. Even beyond wash, use the transportation to move around because they are looked at as dirty. And of course, they are morning, they don't, have bath and they come, but we go in the evening to their homes. They're so clean and nice. You and me dress up and go for work, but they come back and dress up to be at home. So that's a difference in their work itself. And the second thing, when you look at their living condition, right? We have people we work with who are on the pavement, to slums, to public housing. So all, whatever ranges between public housing and pavement, we work with them. So when you look at the positioning of those, public housing, they're always further away from the city. Very few old public housing has happened within the city, but otherwise they're all really, really in the outskirts. So it is built by the local government, but the facilities are so bad that, especially the drainage system, they never work. And for months and years, they don't clean it up. But the same thing when it happens to a middle class home or in the area I live, the next day it is fixed. This is the kind of attitude the administration also have towards the people who work in waste. And the other thing also, when you look at population communities where waste workers or the waste pickers are part of the whole community, even there you see the discrimination. I remember when I started working in 96, and we really wanted to look at 93, 94. That time, I looked at whom we want to work. I was part of SNDT Adult Education Department in Pune. So we went to different parts of the city. We looked at who were the most marginalized communities, especially where women and children are there, and it was waste pickers. When we went to their homes, they were in the outskirts of the slum. It's not like they're very rich people, the other people, but still they were outskirts just because they were from Mang and Matar community, which is Dalit community. Even the access to water was different. Even in Bangalore, today I can say in public housing, where there is only 1 or 2 taps for water, even to collect that water, first the other goes and then the Dalit goes. If there are standing in line together and there is a little bit of water that falls from one pot to another, upper caste, not upper caste, OBC, water pot is got some water from the Dalit community, that whole water, even if during the scarcity of water, they throw away. So this is the attitude they have within the community also. So there is a systemic change that needs to be brought out. And there are a lot of programs we do in the communities where there is a mixed population. We prefer mixed population. We don't want separate slums for waste pickers or separate public housing for waste pickers. We work a lot around it. And what I feel is creating such forums are very important. Now, middle-class citizens in Bangalore really work with waste pickers, and they're happy to invite them to their homes. Of course, it's a small population, whatever it is. So I think that discrimination starts from right from their work to their home. And even in some villages where we work, or tier 2 cities we work, waste picker children are asked to sit separately in schools. And they had bath, they look clean. There's no need to be doing that. They still do happen. So discrimination definitely for wash services and beyond.
Thanks, Anli. Thanks for giving such a real answer of what really goes on, especially on the supply side, especially with these waste pickers and their families. It's clear that caste discrimination is very, very much real in India. It still exists at a phenomenal scale. And I'll come to that in just a bit, but I do want to focus on some of the other drivers of this lack of inclusion, right? So we'll tackle caste almost a separate bucket. We'll get to that. But what are some of the other drivers, Madhavan, Manoj, Nalini, you think that lead to this kind of exclusion, right? And a couple of things you said made me think. So one is this whole queuing process, right? What gets triaged to the front of the queue? What gets sort of addressed first? Why does this exist? What are the knowledge gaps? Is there lack of representation in decision-making settings? Is there lack of resources, lack of policies, or is it just poor implementation? What's really going on? Madan, do you want to begin?
Sure. So I think the first problem on a national scale, Neeraj, is an understanding of who is excluded, being clear about who's excluded and why they're being excluded. The tragedy of our time is that identification of the most marginalized and the excluded continues to be a developmental failure. We've had BPL lists, below poverty line lists, forever. If you speak to anyone who works with communities, these have historically been prone to elite capture, and very often it's a good indicator of who's been excluded. If you want to actually identify those who've been excluded, you should actually look at the BPL list, or the chances are they will never find themselves on it. So, so there's at a fundamental level, there's just this inability for us to identify who these people are, who these excluded are. It's not enough. So in the absence of that, then you tend to rely on proxies like, whether they're scheduled caste or scheduled tribe, to use that to try and target it. But that doesn't solve for it. Mere availability of that information doesn't necessarily mean that they get addressed. And I think that has partially to do with problems in implementation. But there is also a question of prioritization and a question of what gets measured. Because the reality is that what gets measured is what gets done. And if at a leadership level, you're not going to prioritize this, even if you have access to how many families are Dalit, for example, or tribal, but you choose not to ensure that you're monitoring actually their access to it, you're never going to fail, right? You're never going to succeed. So I think there's the identification problem, there is an intent problem, and then there's the implementation problem. There are also challenges with regard to occupational groups, like Nalini works with waste pickers. So waste pickers, sanitation workers, you have other informal sector workers, you have migrants, into urban areas, you have migrants even in rural areas, tea garden estate workers. And you wonder that, so for example, if you were to take the urban poor, broadly in the country, you have people who either reside in what are called notified slums or people who reside in non-notified slums. There are still many cities in this country where if you're a resident of a non-notified slum, the state has no responsibility to even provide you with basic services. So your land tenure and the legality of your settlement becomes a determinant of this. Now, one would have hoped that with a unique identification like Aadhaar, we should have been able to solve for this, but that's not happened. Now, that can't be, so there's a problem there again with implementation and with the intent to use that to just ease the path for some of this. If you look at the plight of manual scavengers, then you would add two other layers to it. One is, sometimes the law itself can become an hindrance by effectively saying that manual scavenging is illegal. Therefore, if a municipal commissioner were to accept that there are 70 families who are manual scavengers, that itself is a violation of the law. Yeah, so you've created a disincentive for people to actually report the existence of this occupation. And then there are questions around accountability, right? You have people who are constantly giving reports saying that there are no manual scavengers in our town, or there's no sanitary, so there's also this question of accountability of them. I think that, so I think we've got to find a way to move forward. And my sense is that our best bet, given the complexity of issues here and the choices that we have, for us, either we sit back and hope that trickle down is going to happen, that you're going to have this remarkable growth consistently, and over a period of time, it is inevitable that trickle down will happen. But the fact is that all of this exclusion is invisible, and I think that the best bet actually for us systemically is to look at investing in building the capacity of institutions for self-governance, whether at a panchayat level or whether at a municipality level, at the ward. You need urban local bodies, because it is easier to demand accountability from them than from some amorphous state which treats everyone as beneficiaries and essentially then robs them of rights that were due as citizens, which is again goes back to this notion that, if you look at all the way all our schemes are designed and the way we, record progress against it, I think one of the most disempowering things is the use of this term beneficiary to even get the numbers of who's being reached. Because beneficiaries then over a period of time believe that they are mere recipients of the largesse of someone else, right? Unlike citizens who have rights and can demand accountability, you then, with a one fell swoop, you have rendered them voiceless and powerless. So I think we should be looking at maybe, in building capacity of institutions of self-governance, looking at their being able to raise revenues on their own so that they can become financially viable institutions, get their own personnel. The 15th Finance Commission is starting to make some of that possible. But I don't see an investment in building the capacities of the institutions to even plan, design, and absorb those funds. And that's, in some sense, a tragedy.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think, and I really like the sort of systemic view you've taken right from the targeting of it, intent, implementation. Nalini, moving to you. I mean, I want you to answer the same question. Clearly, the waste pickup problem, the sanitation worker problem, is not a new. I mean, it's been recognized for now decades, right? And yet, it doesn't seem that the needle is shifting at all. Or it's shifting, I think, in very small pockets, thanks to the work that organizations like yours are doing. But there are millions of people who do this work, and only a very small fraction of them actually are seeing any change. So why is the status quo not changing? There's been so much noise about this, lots of reports published, lots of media coverage, but nothing's really changing. Sorry, you're on mute again, Nalini.
Sorry. So I think there's a lack of representation of people. That is the key, whether it's a representation in ward committee or the representation in your betterment committee of your PHCs or your schools, or in going further in, do you participate in budget making of the city? So there is no representation of the people. Forget about representation. What Madhavan was saying, identification itself is a problem. Today we have Aadhaar card. Everybody is supposed to have Aadhaar card, right? I mean, there are a lot of waste pickers who didn't have any kind of identity before we started working. They lived in Bangalore for 40 to 50 years, okay? So when you have property tax that you can do self-declaration, IT tax, you can do IT returns, you can file with self-declaration, yeah? But when a waste picker wants to get an Aadhaar, you cannot declare. You have to go and get somebody introducing you. Who is it? It is your gazetted officer. Right from there, the recognition or getting an identity has become a major problem. And we have another systemic problem is a lot of people are migrating to urban areas. And maybe because of drought and floods, and a lot of people do come for different kinds of work, and definitely we are seeing that people who are being displaced in forests because of the act. They come to the city and the only thing they know is it's easy to do waste picking, learn about waste picking. They will go pick up because there is no employee-employer relationship. And they don't know anybody in the city. How will you go and say, give me a job? Nobody gives a job. They'll check who that person is, right? So that becomes an easier task to get in. It's true with even street children. So when this kind of migration happens, there is no representation. So it's a status quo. They talk very big. I mean, for waste pickers and sanitation work, everybody wants to talk about them, right from the union government to the local government. How many local government has actually done? The other thing is, we are not organized. If you are not represented, you have to organize yourself. Who is doing it? Alliance of Indian Waste Pickers, which we are part of, we have organized all together, I think 1 lakh waste pickers. But there are 15 to 16 lakh waste pickers. That is also guesstimate. No, there is no proper estimation of people working in waste also. So it becomes the representation is lacking, acceptance of them as a worker itself is a problem. Now we have gone over it and we have a definition of waste pickers in 2016 law. 2016 is just few years ago, but they have been doing this work forever. So identification and also representation is a major issue.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Nalini. Manoj, if you're back, I don't know if you can.
Yeah, I'm back.
Okay,
so without the video for now, but I'm back.
Okay, so we're just discussing the reason why these problems continue to exist without too much change, right? So I wanted to answer this question for, let's say, people with disabilities, right? Now it's clear the numbers are very large. This data also is not very new. It's known for many, many years that literally millions of people who have disabilities who probably face huge challenges in accessing sanitation and water. One, have you seen any sort of given that you work in investing and financing for this space, have you seen any activity within the government or other sort of philanthropic systems to create special funds? Because one imagines that you need some money for some special interventions. And if not, then why not? I mean, why hasn't this been put at the front of the queue rather than at the back of the queue?
So, it's an interesting question. To begin with, very similar to the example which Nalini gave, that you may be having a PWD, a person with disability certificate, but there is not enough of reach happening to those people. There is not enough opportunities for those people, and there is not much skill building for those people. So effectively, it's a very vicious circle that the people with disability find themselves into. There are many of them, and what I'm seeing is at least 40 to 50%. I think it's 43% of the people are 53% of the people are under 39 years of age in India. They are not getting. They need skill development and education in order to come out of that situation. They're just at the grassroots. That's the real problem that is coming through. If that is solved, then there's opportunity of entrepreneurship. There's opportunity of taking valuable employment. There's a need for organizations to create provisions for people with disability to be inclusive. And there is not enough. If you see at every level, there is a skip happening. It's not being included as to the level that it should be, given the number of the population that we're talking about. There is an organization which Water.org works with, which is from the government side, the National Handicap Financing and Development Corporation. They have been able to plug in funds for various for various handicap categories. But that also has got limitations to the way it gets mobilized to the as a financing vehicle. More of such vehicles need to be, financing mechanisms need to be built into and integrated. The good thing is, and the way to solve it is by having, and that's what NHFDC does, is by giving low interest subvention and low interest lending, making it possible, which allows then people to take it. The challenge that they have is that there's lack of awareness that this is there, and therefore not enough lending is happening in that category. That's where we came in. I think what happens also in this vicious trap that the disabled people find themselves is that there's a very high level of blindness to an attitude to what they have become. So it's like even in your own house and in your neighborhood, you get totally marginalized. One of my earliest learnings or stories, which I really, got my attention, was of a young woman who was had severe disabilities, and the family would every day go to for farming, leaving her behind. And so for the neighbors to come and take care of her for while they were outside. And unfortunately, she started to get, people who were coming to help her who instead wanted to ask for sexual favors. And that was a trap. The person is now trapped in every stop and doesn't know how to come out of it. Finally, the idea of, finding a solution with the person, not going out, not being able to interact with people, family not being supportive, and family has its own limitations, family then becoming hardened to the situation. I think that's where the crux of the problem starts, is that if you need to solve the problem, you need to first build awareness and all the other steps following which, and lending is much, much further. It does bring a change in the mindset. But that's my early thoughts. Back to you, Neeraj.
Yeah, that's really heartbreaking, that example that you gave. So I want to sort of talk about...
Go ahead.
Could
I make two other points?
Please, go ahead, Martha.
Thanks. It would be just two other things that I think are important. One is that we should not lull ourselves into thinking that this is only the responsibility of the state and we have no responsibility. We should accept that we're also part of the problem. In the way, all of us on this call, at least all the panelists, are urban residents. How in our own interaction with waste pickers, sanitation workers, domestic workers, do we demonstrate the empathy that is desired? Are we engaging with our resident welfare associations, our apartment complex associations or whatever, to look at better provision of services for them? So I think we need to also accept some responsibility for the fact that we can't, if the state has demonstrated its inability to crack this problem, do we want to continue to just wait for them to do it? Or are we willing to also be part of that change, not just in our organization, but in our own personal lives? So I think we should assume some responsibility for this as well. And the second is that, again, as an extension of not just focusing on the state, is also to look at maybe talking to the private sector. So over a period of time, we've seen a sea of change in the way the private sector is starting to look at sustainability. But, and today, all companies that are looking at sustainability are doing it because they recognize that it affects their bottom line. I think it's time to have conversations with private sector, with large companies about equity, about the fact that there are people being excluded. Do they, so if you have a large office, you employ 3,000 people, you're outsourcing stuff to facility management companies that provide services, right? And you're doing it at arm's length. But does that absolve you of responsibility? Should you be taking that extra step to make sure that they're actually, their health and safety is taken care of, their well-being is taken care of? As part of corporate social responsibility, should we be encouraging them to actually focus on those who are being left behind? Because quite clearly, the state doesn't have the ability to identify, target, and work with them. Can private funds be used for that? Can philanthropy be used for that rather than focusing on lower hanging fruit, as they would call it? I just wanted to add a few things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it starts with individuals, and also I think there are mechanisms in the private sector that can be harnessed. I do want to sort of probe this a little bit more. There's this whole question of design or suboptimal design, right? So Madhavan, your example of, let's say, doors not having latches, to Manoj, your example of the toilets for disabled people, and similarly, Nalini, the thing you're describing about how challenging it is for a waste picker to even get identity, right? So those hurdles they need to jump through. So what's going wrong in the design processes that lead to such things? It could be the design of a physical building. It could be the design of a government process to get something. It could be the design of a campaign. So what's not working in the way these things are getting designed? And what do you think can change? How do we make, I mean, we throw around this word called participatory design, etc., design research. But when you're talking about these kinds of juxtapositions of identity, what do you think will really make a difference?
So I think designing the process or designing a building, all these need little more creativity and innovation, I would say. There are a lot of systemic things that are already there for identity. For example, if I'm uneducated and I'm a Dalit woman, when I go to get my certificate as a scheduled caste, I can never get it because I need to prove that I'm a Dalit. And how can I prove it? Either with your TC from your school, which says you're a Dalit, or your father or your brother should have it, which they don't have. The same thing if my husband goes, my children are engaged in a school which gives an identity and say they are Dalit. My husband can get a scheduled caste certificate. I cannot get. These are systemic things that are there. These are designed process, which is not appropriate. So women by herself cannot declare, cannot prove, cannot do anything to get scheduled caste certificate. So for any benefits that you want, whether it is housing or anything, the certificates are basically very, very important. This is like KYC, right? If I don't have KYC, I don't get anything. So the design of it is so systematic that changing that will really, really take a long time. And also innovation in this space. I think Manoj was talking about, getting new entrepreneurship, different kinds of engagement with the marginalized group. For example, everybody say, oh, sanitation workers. So now waste pickers, they should become sanitation workers. They should be professionalized formalized, not professionalized, formalized. Formalized, they'll get ESI and PF, they get a better job. But actually, when you look at economics of it, formalization of getting ESI and PF is only a casual labor. But waste pickers are not casual labor, they're skilled labor. When you put them into this casual labor kind of a job, actually they will earn less than what they did as an entrepreneur. Waste pickers are entrepreneurs. So this kind of understanding is also lacking in a system. The new innovative ways of working. In Bangalore, we have done phenomenal innovation where we have said PPP should be with waste pickers. So we have an MOU between the local government and waste pickers. We are only a third party to support. Those kind of new ways of engaging the informal sector, engaging the marginalized community is key.
Thanks, Nalini.
So a couple of other things just to add to what Nalini is saying. One, I think, is that we're getting lulled into believing that there is no gap. If that's the dominant narrative, that there is no one left behind, how do you even fix the problem, right? So we have to first start off by recognizing that these are historical problems. These have existed since we became independent. To expect special schemes or programs to solve for this is just not realistic, because they can't do it on their own, because these are more fundamental problems. The fact that there is systemic exclusion needs to be recognized. Two is, what is the value that we assign to this? Today, if you were to look at departments at a state level or at the central level, the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, I don't see people lobbying to become the Minister of Social Justice and Empowerment. secretaries to government who become the heads of departments for this, don't consider it, they say they feel they've been marginalized if they get posted there. So that's the value that we assign to it.
Demotion. They consider it as demotion.
Demotion, yeah. So, and then you end up with having these special schemes, which special schemes they haven't worked. No one even tracks over a period of time what the the deliverables on those are, what are the outcomes, what is the progress. It's like you park, and these are invariably very, very small sums of money. And so there's an issue also with the fact that, so we've got to recognize this is a systemic problem. You can't marginalize the issue. You've got to mainstream it, right? You've got to make it a part of your norm. And it has to be a priority for everyone. We can't just wait. We can't now, increasingly now we call it the last mile problem. But we're never the last mile, right? It's always someone else who's part of that last mile. And so it never gets done.
Yeah, very well put, Madhavan. Manoj, do you want to add something to this?
Yeah, I was actually reflecting upon the earlier comment which Madhavan given about the direction that CSR funding needs to be there. And to me, it's a very interesting model where the concept of blended financing plays in a very useful way. What we have is, it's a PPP, it's a combination of funding where you can actually do a number of impact funding coming in, but it is also bringing in the different types of finances at the same time to the same objective. Mm-hmm. And it's, unless we don't do it, because we've got to the sum total that is available by the government, and apart from the lack of attention to it or their own feeling marginalized, the fact is that there is very little budgets allocated to such ideas, and especially like toilets which are which can be supporting people with disabilities, having special additional toilets which are there, and not just having two gender toilets, having allowing gender neutral toilets. This mindset requires more funding, and the minute you go into that trap, there's just not place for, they're just not open to it. So alternative solutions which can actually say, if you can give your valuable $40 and somebody else can bring in another, and that's how the solution then starts building into it. We found, and there's an excellent example that we saw, which UNICEF did in Angul district, where they built e-toilets with food marts combined to it run by transgenders. And it's a wonderful story where a district collector in Angul, I mean, you have to think about it, had the position of saying, if we can create not just the toilet, but actually create revenue stream with it, and therefore be able to sustain the entire operation of the toilets run by transgenders, we've really started to move along, move that dial in a very big way in that process. So that's, to me, what really stands out is the way the government should look at it, the way CSR should look at it, and the way people should look at different people marginalized. Back to you, Neerat.
That's a great example, and actually that becomes a good sort of pivot in this conversation. So we've been talking about problems and drivers of these problems. Let's now actually look at some very tangible solutions that you are all seeing in your sort of in your works. So if I were to just ask you to identify maybe one or two projects or programs or innovations that you've seen that really very directly have led to identity-led inclusion within water sanitation services, what would those one or two projects be for you? So which you think can truly be scaled?
In any particular order?
No, whoever wants to go first.
Okay, I'll do it before I have a next power failure in my place.
Okay.
So, 3 years back, when we were going through this, our journey of SBM and, building to the next of ODF plus, we realized, and one of the beauty of when you start, financially mobilizing alternative funds is you really get to understand the needs of the people at the village, at the bottom. What we found was that there was need not just for having new toilet construction, but also the idea that of having respectable toilets. Toilet improvement loans started to come up very quickly. Toilet renovation loans, because the toilets that were built earlier and during the period were at one stage needed to be repaired and improved. And the doors and knobs and all those things were falling apart for them. There were loan requirements for retrofitting, one of the things that never happened. And another need that came out was accessible family toilets. So we realized that, and there was 6% of the population comes with a family member with some disability. We realized that needs to be addressed through. And so if maybe, Sanjana, if you can play a video, it's one of what we started to, and before I get down to showing a video, and it's a little, I had to edit it. It's a very long video. But what we realized was that we have a way to reach the people. And for those people, it's not just important, just not the knowledge has to be given, but also the technical knowledge has to be given. The behavioral understanding has to be given. And an inclusiveness, what was earlier being talked about, an inclusiveness feeling has to be created. So people think of disability when it happens. People don't think of it as an accessible family toilet, or don't think of it as something which needs to be planned as part of, even aging creates disability. So there's a more natural way to look at it rather than looking at it as, oh, it's my neighbor's child has a problem. So given that, maybe you'll see, we'll take a quick, it's a 2 to 3 minutes video, and hopefully it will give you a sense of how we are trying to build the inclusiveness. Over to you, Sahana. Sanjana, sorry.
और सिर्फ यही नहीं, आप मन ही मन,
yeah, it's in between we have started.
आप मन ही मन ये भी जरूर सोचते हैं कि आप अपने बच्चों के साथ घर में खेलेंगे, लेकिन इन सब के बीच हम अपने घर के उस महत्वपूर्ण हिस्से पर ध्यान नहीं देते, और वो है टॉयलेट या शौचालय। क्या ये टॉयलेट या शौचालय आपकी गर्भवती पत्नी के लिए आरामदेह है? क्या ये टॉयलेट आपके बढ़ते हुए बच्चों के लिए सुरक्षित है? क्या ये टॉयलेट आपके बूढ़े हो रहे माता पिता के लिए सुविधाजनक है? और क्या आपके लिए भी ठीक है, क्योंकि आप भी कभी बूढ़े जरूर होंगे? मुख्य रूप से क्या आपका शौचालय अब और जीवन में आगे आने वाली सभी अनिश्चितताओं के लिए आरामदायक है? समय का कुछ पता नहीं होता, कब क्या हो जाए। चोट लगने पर कभी कभी व्हीलचेयर भी इस्तेमाल करना पड़ जाता है। व्हीलचेयर आपकी जिंदगी आसान करने का तब एक जरिया बन जाती है। ऐसे अवसरों पर सुगम्य शौचालय अत्यंत लाभकारी साबित होते हैं। अगर आपके घर में सुगम्य शौचालय होगा तो मरीज या जिसे चोट लगी है उसके देखभाल करने वाले को भी आसानी होती है। और सबसे बड़ी बात तो ये है कि इससे पूरे परिवार यानी आपके बच्चे, गर्भवती महिलाएं, बुजुर्ग, इन सब को सुरक्षा मिलती है। सुगम्य शौचालय सभी को आसानी, आराम, सुरक्षा, गरिमा और स्वतंत्रता प्रदान करता है। यदि आपने अभी तक टॉयलेट के बारे में नहीं सोचा है तो ये आपके लिए सबसे बढ़िया समय है कि आप इस पर काम करना शुरू कर दें। स्वयं एवं फास आपके लिए 3 तरह के टॉयलेट यहाँ प्रस्तुत कर रहे हैं जो आपके जीवन की हर स्थितियों में आपकी सहायता करेंगे। AFT Accessible Family Toilet, RAFT Reduced Accessible Family Toilet और ADA Ambulant Disabled Toilet। Accessible Family Toilet सुगम्य पारिवारिक शौचालय परिवार के सभी सदस्यों के लिए जीवन में हर समय उपयोगी है, पर कुछ सदस्यों के लिए अति आवश्यक है, जैसे बच्चे, बुजुर्ग, गर्भवती महिलाएं, नई माताएं, बीमारी या चोट का इलाज करवा रहे सदस्य या विकलांगजन। शौचालय के अंदर कम से कम 7 बाय 5.5 फीट की जगह रखी जाती है। सीमित बजट की स्थिति में केवल एक हैंडरेल जो 3 फीट की ऊंचाई पर लगी हो, इसको भी लगा सकते हैं। दोनों तरफ हैंडरेल के साथ इंडियन स्क्वाट पैन शौचालय आपके वर्तमान शौचालय की सुगम्यता को बेहतर बनाता है। पर ध्यान रहे, ये शौचालय उनके लिए बिल्कुल उपयुक्त नहीं है जिन्हें उकड़ू बैठने में दिक्कत है, या वो सदस्य जो किसी चोट इत्यादि के कारण व्हीलचेयर प्रयोग करने की आवश्यकता अनुभव करते हैं। आप सुगम्य पारिवारिक शौचालय के निर्माण के लिए अब अपने नजदीकी वित्तीय संस्थानों से कर्ज भी ले सकते हैं। यही नहीं, आप अपनी जरूरत के हिसाब से इन 4 प्रकार के टॉयलेट में से कोई एक बनवा सकते हैं, या जो टॉयलेट आप उपयोग कर रहे हैं उसको अपनी जरूरत के हिसाब से मॉडिफाई या संशोधित करवा सकते हैं। आप अपने परिवार की खुशी को भविष्य के लिए नहीं टालते, बल्कि इसके लिए वर्तमान में ही जरूरी कदम उठाते हैं।
Thank you, Sanjana.
That was fantastic, Manoj. And I think what I really liked about this messaging was how it sort of made it salient to a lot of people who are, and sort of almost normalizes the idea of disabled friendly toilets. So that was fantastic. Nalini, would you like to go next? One or two sort of case studies of things which have worked really well to further inclusion for waste pickers and sanitation workers.
I'd like to talk about the identification. In 2011, we talked to the local government. Of course, Lok Adalat was also involved. For the first time, we said, you own the work of waste pickers. You find the number of waste pickers in the city and then provide them services. So they did a enumeration of waste pickers, and it was a very, very detailed enumeration form that we all put together and did it together. And also we put in a lot of stuff like 2 people should sign, one citizen and one local government person can sign, but it's a self-declaration. There is no need for anybody else to do it, but the people that they know locally. So that is what was done. And today in 2016, solid waste management rules, it's become compulsory that every Gram Panchayat and every urban local body should give them an ID card. Whether it has really been implemented, not very well, but Swachh Bharat Abhiyan gives marks for people where they have given ID cards to waste pickers. And recently we did have a conversation about it with our Swachh Bharat Abhiyan director, who has promised that we'll all sit together and actually do the uniformed, enumeration form across the country. Because they had given us 85,000 enumerated of, numbers, and they gave us the database a couple of years ago. When we really looked at the city where we are in connection, they were really not the waste pickers. The definition of waste pickers were different, and they just put all the sanitation workers in one place, contractor workers in it. So it was not the best thing. So I think that really, really helped us to do it. And integrate them into the solid waste management has happened quite well in Karnataka. So all the dry waste today in Bangalore is a very big city. After 10 years of demonstrating and, continuously working with the local government, all the dry waste of the city is collected by either waste picker or, SSG group. So which is a huge success and an alternate way of working. And PPP model is between waste pickers and the local government to run a dry waste collection center. So I would say this is one of the things that has been extremely successful for us.
And you think this model is something that can scale across?
Yeah, it's across. Yeah. Karnataka actually dry waste collection center itself, when we demonstrated and worked in 2019, Karnataka state put dry waste collection center as a decentralized model in their budgets. So every city in Karnataka and every Gram Panchayat in Karnataka should have a dry waste collection center. So that's also been quite successful for us.
Great. Madhavan?
So sure, let me try and infuse some hope into this by three examples, and which are at reasonable scale and outside of us in some sense. The first one is around inclusive toilets, and the Chhattisgarh government a couple of years ago announced a pilot project for converting or ensuring that households with persons who are differently abled actually had accessible toilets. And they put in some money for it, and they actually then raised money as part of CSR from our public sector undertaking, and they launched this pilot project. And Chhattisgarh as state government has a policy on inclusive toilets for people who are differently abled as well as for transgender population. And so it's an example of a state government taking this as an issue and choosing to create a state policy for it. Another example of another state government which has done something similar is the Odisha government and the Garima scheme for sanitation workers, where essentially for safety and dignity of sanitation workers, this Garima scheme was launched by the chief minister. And it essentially covers issues around safety, service benefits, health and safety, social security for all sanitation workers in the state. And there's actually a mechanism for ensuring that there is identification and then a host of activities that need to be done at every urban local body, municipality to do it, as well as bodies to help have oversight, ways by which you can seek redressal if something goes wrong. And I think it's a great example of a state government deciding to take this on and to actually create a state scheme for addressing this issue. And the third is I'll leave you with a couple of examples of sort of marginalized groups and how even in a large campaign like Swachh Bharat Mission, where you had inspired leadership at a state level, it was possible to look at using a large scheme and also to address issues of inclusion. One was about the government of Assam deciding to work with tea garden estate workers. And they recognized that tea garden estate workers were a vulnerable group because many of them were residing in settlements that were not recognized as habitations, that they needed to provide them with access to toilets through Swachh Bharat Mission. And they found a way to do it and on scale in the state, which I think is huge. And I've worked in a neighboring state, and in Assam also we've had some experience, and we've actually found that toilet coverage was high and usage in many areas tends to be high. So it makes a difference. Another example is of how in Gujarat they looked at constructing community toilets in areas where there were migrant workers coming in for agricultural harvest. To help with the harvest, there were migrant workers coming in, and they actually recognized the need for community toilets for them. So it's a migrant population. They come in, they go. But the fact is that as part of the scheme, they were willing to recognize and create the space for it. So there is hope. You need inspired leadership, but it can happen. I've never found rules to get in the way for decision makers who want to take action.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, Madan. And I want to keep some time for audience questions as well. So maybe we'll end with one final sort of question to all of you. If you had this genie, right, and you could make one or two wishes, or let's say just one wish each, of what needs to change to make who needs to do what to make sanitation more inclusive, water and sanitation more inclusive for people with these identities. So what would your one wish be? Maybe we'll start with Manoj and then Madhavan and Nalini.
Sure. So let me take the liberty of quickly putting in 2-3 wishes. If you're giving me the chance, might as well use it fully, right? Sure. So, first of all, what is required for reaching is that a lot of grassroots level education and awareness building that needs to be done. So, every time I see a problem and I see people like, Moderate and Madhavan and Nalini who are addressing some issue at a very deep level, it really gives the confidence that that first layer of understanding is built in. But to address water and sanitation issues will require much more than that. For instance, when we get down to disability toilets, we recognize that, one of the big early challenges that we had was we thought that, rural India, only the Indian pan will work. So it's a mindset which we were having a block mind to. We realized after a number of tests that actually they're quite open to the idea to solve their problem if they can have accessible toilets which are using the Indo-Anglo toilets or the Western toilet seats. They're okay as long as they get the dignity. They are more than willing to adapt to the situation, but they need awareness. Second, the environment requires things like mason training. So we talk about mason training, but we don't have enough mason training for solving these kind of problems. And we need a better supply chain. A marketplace needs to be created where these products are like, handlebars and the bell and, doors, knobs, especially for handicapped people, is available. So until these things don't start coming in from different angles, it still remains a very vicious trap that you have not been able to solve. So those are collectively, I love to see those problems being addressed. Back to you, Neeraj.
Thanks, Manoj. Madhavan?
So one sentence, Neeraj, identify who the excluded are, track them, and make access or inclusion a metric of your success.
So for me, organizing and building leadership in the communities, because we are there or we are not there, the leadership will always remain in the community, and providing the space for decision makers to listen to them. For example, when we started our work in 2010, we used to have this WhatsApp groups with waste pickers and commissioners and joint commissioners and everyone. I would tell waste pickers, if you can't write it, just leave a message. They'll learn how to do it. So they were able to, the commissioners were able to listen to them, So creating such spaces is very key. Once they were speaking, waste picker Lakshmi was speaking and said, I love our commissioner because he gave me an ID card. And I left a message for him and I got an ID card. I said, who is your commissioner? Yeah, there is a commissioner. She didn't realize the person who was sitting next to her on the dais was a commissioner. So it was just an amazing thing that even if you don't see, you can still connect to them. So this kind of spaces for the community to represent themselves is very key.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Okay, so we got a couple of questions and then one really relevant comment, which I'll read out loud. So the first question I think is to you, Nalini. So anonymous question. Do you see the privatization or corporatization of wash services, such as urban waste picking, as a potential solution that could offer better wages and employment benefits? Or would it just be a way for the state to absolve itself of responsibility while inequities continue to persist or get exacerbated?
There can be something in between. It doesn't have to be extreme of two. So the first part, what you said, I was talking about casual labor, casual labor. When you move them into some kind of, ESIPF and regular job kind of a thing. But if you make them entrepreneurs, even within entrepreneur, even in corporate private sector, there are different ways of doing it. It's not like one big corporation coming and doing. It could be entrepreneurs of waste pickers who are running it. And we have seen it in Bangalore. We have more than 100, people who are entrepreneurs now in Bangalore. And they are giving jobs to waste pickers and they have a better relationship with them. So they have a better life. So let's not think about this way or that way, but let's look at what is the middle ground. Professionalizing this service is what I would look at it, not really formalization.
Right. Madhavan, I know you've also thought about accountability very deeply, and you also talked about it. What's your take on where does responsibility ultimately sit? Where does accountability really sit, even if some of these things have been privatized, tendered out?
I would tend to agree with Nalini as well. That I think that we need to make a distinction between duty bearers and service providers. And our problem is that we assume that, or the duty bearer assumes that it is their responsibility to provide services as well. It need not be. So if you make that distinction that who is responsible for this, who's ultimately accountable for the provision of services, and who's responsible for delivery of services and make a distinction, it shouldn't matter whether it's a private service provider or a collective which is doing it, or whether it's the state which is doing it. But ultimately, government has to be accountable and responsible for it. So to me, that distinction is important, that as long as government is willing to assume responsibility for the provision of basic services, I'm not fussed about who actually provides the service.
No, I think that's super insightful. Okay, so now we'll go to the second question, and then I'll read out the comment after you've all answered. And I think this question is interesting about what measures do you think could be taken to encourage more entrepreneurs to work towards the problem of inclusivity in sanitation? So how can entrepreneurs working on these kinds of topics, how can they solve for inclusiveness? And I think all three of you actually might have interesting takes on this. So maybe we'll start with Manoj, and then Nalini, and then Madhavan.
Yeah, sure. In order to build entrepreneurship, I think one of the ways to do it is by using champions within the community itself that you're serving. Whichever be the community, you've got to find people who can inspire themselves. And that actually sets the stage for others to come in. It also sets the stage for meaningful employment because of that one person's with this. So it has a lot of trickle effect that is coming in. For entrepreneurs to be interested to enter the sector from the other side, if you look at it, there could be a number of ways to do it. One, there has to be a sense of committed by the government, showing them that what support can be given in the first few years to provide to enter that sector. It's going to be a difficult sector. To solve that problem, you are not going to be getting at the same, because at the end of it, money is fungible. So why would somebody want to put money into a sector which is not organized, rather go to something which is more secure, risk averse, and be getting the same amount of money? We have assured income. So in order to do that, there has to be some impetus by the government to make those small groups happen and then invite people. And that's when the shift starts happening into it. That's my thought on both for people within and then outside to come in. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
For me, building the ecosystem, just making entrepreneurship entrepreneurs itself is not enough, but create a system that entrepreneur thrives. That is equally important. For example, we work with NSKBC and Vijaya Bank, who are willing to give, loans for vehicles. But we said vehicle loans are not necessary right now. What we need is a cash flow for managing the waste. So we actually created an overdraft facility. And that was never heard of in NSKPC history also. I have not heard about getting overdraft facility for a waste picker. We did get it, and it really worked like it's never ending money. That 1 lakh, you can keep using it. But there was a change in NSKFTC leadership, so the scheme has gone. So innovation is required. Ecosystem to continue for the innovation is also very, very essential. And the policy should enable continuation of this particular entrepreneurs and thrive. That is very important.
Thanks, Anali. Madhavan, your take on this? Because the thing I'm really reading here is the complication here is social entrepreneurship in these spaces is anyway very difficult, right? So the economics aren't great, it's slightly informal. And then when you layer on these considerations, does it become even more complex to have a thriving sort of business? And what can entrepreneurs do to really bring in these inclusion aspects very actively and maybe because of that thrive or in spite of that or do well?
So, Neeraj, I think it's important to recognize that profit is a very powerful motive and incentive, right? But entrepreneurs need to be clear about where the market is. So there's an information asymmetry that sometimes you're not aware of where that market is and the fact that an inclusive product could have a market. And therefore, that in some sense inhibits both the innovation and the emergence of an entrepreneurial ecosystem that Nalini was talking about. Because if you're not aware of it, you won't. But however, despite that, so for example, I've seen as part of a hackathon, innovators coming up with a simple wheelchair that you could use, which would allow you to actually use a toilet that was a regular Indian toilet, but can be used for someone who's differently abled. So you don't even need to retrofit your toilet, but your wheelchair itself or a simple device can be made which allows for that conversion to happen. Now, it's because that was the challenge posed to them that they found a solution, right? Otherwise, they won't have. Today, for example, we're seeing innovations around incinerators for malls and large office buildings for managing menstrual waste. So somebody has actually discovered or recognized that here's a business opportunity and is finding really simple solutions to do that. So I think we need to address that information asymmetry, that entrepreneurs need to sense or be aware of where that business opportunity is. And if there is a business opportunity, then they will find solutions to it. And the big advantage there, even beyond just whether it's an inclusive product or not, is that large emergence of options will also make them affordable and bring the costs down. And that's also an important inhibitor of people getting access to some of this.
Yeah. It's a very, very important point. Okay, so we've actually got one more question that's coming, but why don't I read the comment? If Shivika has written this, if she's comfortable, maybe Shivika, if you're comfortable, would you like to read this out, what you've put down? I can sort of, we can give you audio access. Shivika, if you can hear this, yeah.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Namaste. It was quite an insightful session on how we can make WASH inclusive. So I want to share a very personal experience. I used to work in Central Building Research Institute, that is in IIT Roorkee campus. And the organization is dedicated towards building and construction research. But they have failed to build toilets for women in their own workspace. So there are only 2 toilets available, and they both are on the ground floor. So I used to have my workspace assigned on the 2nd floor. To get fresh, I had to come down to the ground floor. There was no medical aid in case someone menstruates and don't have a sanitary pad. And the scientists, most often they are males there, they used to shout in case I or my colleague are missing. And we generally used to go washroom, and he used to treat as if we are going for, for shopping or for a treat. To add, the washrooms available to us often were in a bad state as they were cleaned only when requested, or sometimes they used to be no water. So I had a chance to visit to the block where our director used to sit. And I was astonished to find that the washrooms there were really in a good condition. And they were neat and clean, though they were leaking. So this reflects the positioning of toilets in a government building itself as a function of who sits where. Where the director was sitting, the washrooms were clean, neat, and on every floor there is a washroom for a woman also. But whereas every in the blocks where project assistants work and the scientists work, there the washrooms are not available for women. So it is a function of the power dynamics and the overlapping of identities, I feel. Yeah, thank you for allowing me to share this story. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, so we'll take the final question, which is from Akshat. So he's asking essentially, when it comes to CSR, private companies tend to invest in areas that are somewhat aligned to the business model. Zomato, for instance, does tree planting to reduce carbon footprint. What kinds of companies, which kinds of sectors, corporate sectors, would be interested in funding the kind of inclusion activities we've described today?
For me, I'm not going to talk much about CSR, but the CSR law has laid out what needs to be supported, and this is one of them. But for me, the foundations have been much more inclusive in providing such support, and those foundations may be from founder of a corporate. But foundations seem to be much easier for us. For us as Hasrudala has been successful in foundation rather than CSR.
I don't think there's a barrier per se about any institution, of any particular sector showing an interest in doing this. I don't see that as a barrier at all. Part of the problem with particularly CSR is the backyard problem, which is that the first default of any company is to work in their own backyard, where your workforce comes from, supply chain is. But the reality of the matter is that poverty and exclusion need not be in the same geographies where industries are present or where your supply chain is. So if you would actually map, so if you look at current corporate social responsibility spends in India, you'll find that states like Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu get a bulk of it. Whereas if you look at poverty, you'll find it in other states where in those districts, you might not even have any industrial presence. So I think you have to first get rid of that backyard problem. Other than that, I don't see anything that should motivate someone to want to do this. If you've got the spare cash, there's nothing that will inhibit you from doing this.
Thanks, Madhan. All right.
Just a quick comment on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think the CSR definitely, the challenge is that our CSR and our corporate mentality is short term. They look at everything happening. I'm doing this because it has to connect with my business or it has to be around my business. And it's a very short term position. But the more strategic CSR mindset says, it doesn't have to connect with the short term. It doesn't have to connect with your business bottom line. It has to just connect with the longer reach that you are creating. And the reach itself then eventually will benefit your bottom line too. And so there are many organizations, Levers, Reckitt, you look at Telco, Tata's, they have their comments, their perspective is so much wider than having short-term. Microsoft, which are operating in India, and their position is where they are willing to invest today for their CSR funds because getting a better population eventually will mean to them better returns. I know that some of the examples I gave were perhaps the upper side, but if the organizations that when we're working with CSR need to actually shift the way they think on their ROIs and what they're trying to do. That's one thought. I also just wanted to take a very quick, comment back on Shivika's arduous journey that she was having. I was recently reading in the Delhi Transport DTC has for the women drivers. I think there's only 1 or 2 women drivers. There are only 2 bus stands or depots, one in Dholakua in Delhi and one in Sarojini Nagar, where there are women toilets. That's the state we are in. We are in Delhi. We are in the most urban places. And for women drivers, there's only 2 stops. So the driver has to actually wait till they reach one of the 2 points and then relieve themselves. So a lot can be done right now to solve these problems. Even at an aggregate level, we need to start being more inclusive just to the women gender and then think about others. Back to you guys.
Thanks, Manoj. That example is quite something. Just 2 locations in Delhi for those. That's crazy. Okay, well, I think it's time to wrap this really rich conversation. Thank you, Madhvan, Nalini, and Manoj. I personally really enjoyed this. This is something that one has been thinking about quite a lot, and just discussing this with all three of you, and getting your perspectives on how does the problem manifest, why does it sort of why does status quo sort of stay as is without too much change, and yet what are some of these case studies, what are some of these things that we can look forward to. I personally learned a lot. I think I also want to thank the audience for the questions, Sanjana for organizing this. We will edit all of this down into individual sort of videos and audio episodes, and then we'll share this. But thank you for just being so generous with your time and your thinking.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Neerath. Thanks for moderating the session so well.
Thanks.
Thanks. Sorry, I just want to make a couple of announcements before we drop off about particularly this session, which is scheduled for tomorrow with our lovely partners at JPAL is going to be hosting a panel on research to action, designing inclusive policies. And we have really interesting speakers like Biswara Wilson from Safai Karmachari Andolan, Dr. Ashwini Deshpande from Ashoka University, Meera Shenoy who's the founder of Youth for Jobs. So please tune in if you're interested, and we really hope to see you all there. And secondly, we're also very excited to share that Belongs recently launched a very interesting app called Another, which is a short format literary content mobile app focused on diversity and inclusion for South Asian audience. And it is live on Google Play Store. So if you're interested, I've shared the link on chat. So please feel free to check that out. And yeah, that's it from me. Thanks once again.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.